So I don't do a lot of non-fiction book reviews, but I do read non-fiction. So I thought maybe I would start kind of doing non-fiction roundup reviews rather than reviewing one at a time. And I decided to review these 3 non-fiction books I've read earlier this year, all in one video for those of you that are interested. I think I'm going to go from my favourite to my least favourite, but I didn't dislike any of these books. I think they all had their merits, and just some blew me away more than others. The 3 that I will be talking about in this video are The Honour Code, How Moral Revolutions Happen by Kwame Anthony Appiah, The Philosophy of Vegetarianism by Daniel A. Dombrowski, and Epicureanism by Tim O'Keefe. So let's start with, like I said, my favourite that stands out from the bunch, and that is How Moral Revolutions Happen, The Honour Code by Kwame Anthony Appiah. I was very close to giving this a 5-star review, and in fact I would recommend it to almost everybody. I really enjoyed this non-fiction. It flowed so well, it was so pleasant to read from beginning to end, even though it was a non-fiction. And I find that a lot of non-fiction can be, although very informative and nice to dip in and out of, it's difficult to get that structure right from beginning to end to make it actually flow as an enjoyable read. Surprisingly, this was not in any way about ancient history, which is my usual go-to non-fiction genre. This book deals with 4 different cultures and the way in which the honour code works in these cultures, or did work in these cultures, as it does deal with historical cultures. Honour is something I myself study in my research, although in antiquity, but I think the author in this book is very much just dealing with the concept of honour and using these 4 examples as like case studies, so this is a very interesting book when approaching all types of history and modern cultures. It's very much food for thought. The first chapter was on duelling in Britain in around the 1800s. The second chapter was on Chinese foot binding. The third section was on Atlantic slavery and Britain's reaction to slavery. And the 4th chapter, which came as a complete surprise to me, was actually on current honour killings in Arabic countries. So this book definitely started off as history and then kind of by the end took historical examples, looked at a modern example and how we changed honour codes and overcame practices that were quite cruel, often abusive, and tried to learn from these and propose ways in which we could change current culture and honour codes. And the book itself does emphasise the fact that honour codes are part of almost every culture throughout time. In the 21st century Western world we have honour codes, you might just not be aware of it. It's such an ingrained part of society, and it was very interesting for me when then studying honour codes in classical Athens. It really emphasises the fact that honour is something that is observed. Although it's felt innately, it's also something, it requires an audience. That makes sense. I could talk about this book for days and days, but I would highly recommend reading it. It's a really easy read and really fascinating, and I think because it has all these different topics in it and it changes it up regularly enough, it keeps you interested. The only reason I think I gave it 5 stars in the end is because the final section, the 5th section, which was on lessons and legacies, I just didn't agree with all of his conclusions, although I think, like, we have the same opinion, we disagreed with things. I guess I just had a different opinion on how things would work. But I found that really interesting to be able to engage with it, and I felt like he'd given me the information I needed to engage with it properly. And some sections definitely stood out above others, but otherwise would highly recommend. Next up is The Philosophy of Vegetarianism by Daniel A. Dombrowski, and this one is actually about ancient vegetarianism, so it's about vegetarians in antiquity and different philosophers and intellectual figures that chose to become vegetarian and why they chose to become vegetarian and the philosophy behind that decision. I thought it was a really interesting overview. It dealt with Epicureans, it dealt with Pythagoreans, Neoplatonists, all over the shop really, and some of it was really well informed, accurate information, which I found really interesting and it made me want to look into it more. I think it was really well written and easy to read again, well flowing. However, I think you could tell he was a vegetarian, which I sympathise with because I'm a vegetarian, but there were multiple areas where he would say things that personally were, from what I could tell, based on absolutely no evidence, that he pulled out of the sky. And I think he just wanted to be true more than actually were true, so he'd like, fact, and then I think this was actually the case for these figures they were probably vegetarians too, even though there's no real evidence to support this. So it lacked something really as an academic text, and you could tell that the author's not a trained ancient historian or classicist. I've looked up and he's written non-fiction books on various topics, and classics isn't his speciality, and I think some of his conclusions were really interesting, but you need to take them with a pinch of salt, because as much as I wish everyone was an awesome vegetarian with awesome logic for being vegetarians, he jumped to too many conclusions in my opinion, and some of it could have been true, other things I just think were wrong. But I think you can spot those moments, because those are the moments where he doesn't have actual evidence to prove it, and that's when you just need to make sure you're using a discerning eye when reading this book. But otherwise, really enjoyed it, and I think it was a really, really interesting book about some of the origins of vegetarianism and some of the early vegetarians that we have recorded. And last but not least is Epicureanism by Tim O'Keefe, and this is just a basic introduction to Epicureanism, which is an ancient Greek philosophy of the Hellenistic period. It then was taken on as well by ancient Romans, but it began with the Greek philosopher Epicurus. So this one I think flowed relatively well, but it was a little less pleasurable to read from beginning to end than the other two. Epicureanism is a bit of a pseudo-scientific philosophy. It's one of the early philosophies that believed in atomism and had a lot of theories about physics and things like that, so it can be a little bit clunky. We also are missing information. Some of the theories are a little bit difficult to understand, but he does try and present them in a way that is understandable, and I think he does do a really good job of making it a consumable philosophy and narrowing it down to a consumable book, because it's not terribly long. It's less than 200 pages, and I think it's a fantastic introduction to this philosophy. I do remember reading this and not being compelled to read it all the time. Sometimes I put it down and was just a bit like and some bits were a bit repetitive, but then in a way they needed to be repetitive to enforce some of the ideas, because some of it was kind of difficult to grasp. And it might be partially to do with my interest in the topic, whether maybe I'm just not as interested in the topic as I could have been. But I do generally quite enjoy ancient philosophy, and Epicureanism is one of my preferred philosophy, although I did a course on it and wrote a lot of essays on it in my masters, which has made me kind of hate it temporarily, so maybe my opinion is slightly biased, because I've kind of been Epicureaned out. It's an excellent start. I think it's got some really, really good information in it. I just don't think it was quite as fun to read as the other two books in this one, and was a bit more clunky, but I think in part that was because of the topic it was dealing with. But yes, those are the three non-fiction books I wanted to share with you today. Hopefully before the year is out I'll do another one of these with another 3 non-fiction books. If you like this one, please do let me know so I know whether to do more of them or not. But until next time guys, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye!